Mr Speaker.
Ko Moana Mackie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And as colleagues my Labor colleagues who've spoken before me have said, Labor will be opposing this piece of legislation. And I say to the member who's just taken her seat that fine words are all very well and good, but what we need is actually decent legislation if we're serious about protecting New Zealand's exclusive economic zone. That's not true. Dr Smith says Labor did nothing in 9 years, and he knows that's not true. An awful lot of work went into this. Unfortunately, while Nick Smith was parading up and down the country saying the beaches belong to everyone, no deals, don't let Māori have access to the foreshore and seabed, while he was planting New Zealand flags and raising up all that racial tension that resulted in the foreshore and seabed issue, that work had to be put on hold because clearly there were implications for the foreshore and seabed issue of the oceans policy work that Labor was working on. And we went through that period of time, and as the Minister well knows, that he could have picked up that work, he has picked up the work that Labor was doing in this area, and instead he's made significant changes to it, which has meant that Labor cannot support it. I would say there are two other things that have changed since that time. The first is we have a national government who, the minute they came in, said that they went out there and said to the world, we want more oil and gas exploration in New Zealand. They ramped that up big time. It's not something they've ever denied. They saw that as a big part of New Zealand's economic future. So they went ahead and ramped it up, and the Minister's acknowledging that despite there not being the protections in place. Despite there not being any protections in the EZ, they went ahead and said, we want to do a lot more oil and gas. It has happened. Come up my way. Well, I invite any government minister to actually front up in Gisborne and on the East Coast instead of running away and hiding every time they're invited to come and explain their position around oil and gas exploration in the Rokumura Basin, but they don't. They hide and they send government officials. Our local MP doesn't show up, the minister doesn't show up, no one fronts to talk to the people on the East Coast who are concerned about what's going on in their exclusive economic zone. So that's the second thing that's changed. The third thing that's changed is the Gulf of Mexico oil spill was a big wake-up call for everyone, because we've been told time and time again that technology has developed so far, which I'm sure it has, that there's a lot more protections in place, that we're able to do this in a way that's a lot safer, that we're not going to have the kind of accidents that we've had in the past. And I think largely the public had accepted that. The public had accepted that the technology made the oil and gas exploration a lot safer. And what the Gulf of Mexico disaster showed us is that, in fact, those dangers are very much still there, and they're there in a big way. And if we're not able to deal with them, if we haven't got issues of liability sorted out up front, if we haven't got the capacity to carry out a clean-up in the country, is this something that we want to be ramping up, as the national government is doing, before we get those protections in place? So I think it's all very well for members to criticise the previous government and to criticise Labor for not supporting this legislation, but we've taken all that on board. We've learnt from the developments that have happened over the last few years, and we do not believe that this piece of legislation is going to provide the protection that New Zealanders want to guarantee, as much as you can, that the kind of disaster that we saw in the Gulf of Mexico is not going to occur here in New Zealand. So I think there are three things actually about this legislation that are concerning. The first is that, as we know, the RMA applies out to 12 miles, and the RMA's principles are very clear. They're very well known, that they are around the protection of our natural environment and our natural resources. But when we get beyond that, these well-known principles of the RMA, principles that have been well tested, that people understand, once you get beyond that 12-mile zone, that no longer applies, and instead the government's put in this new test, which is one around a balance, which is always a nightmare, a balance between economic development and environmental protection. And I know that the community I live in on the East Coast are asking, well, why could we not have the same principles? Why is it that beyond 12 miles, apparently those principles of being about environmental protection don't apply? It's now a balance. But within 12 miles they do. And the Minister, Nick Smith, is on record as saying this is because what occurs in the exclusive economic zone doesn't affect communities. And I say again to the Minister, if he really believes that, then come to Gisborne and say that. Go up the East Coast, go into the tribal areas of Te Whānau, Apanui and Ngāti Porou, it is, and tell them, no, I'm not making it up, Minister, and the little smile on your face tells me you know very well that's what you said. It was a direct quote where the Minister said that we're not extending the principles of the RMA out because what occurs there doesn't affect communities. Does the Minister believe that? Yeah, he's gone quiet. He's gone absolutely quiet because it does affect communities. It does affect communities. And the communities along the East Coast where that exploration is occurring in the exclusive economic zone are very affected, and they were not consulted. And there are no environmental protections in place. So if the Minister is so passionate about the exclusive economic zone, its protection, why did he not put on hold those consents until the protections were in place? Because it's only seismic surveys. And yet, there were still intrinsic dangers in carrying out that work. And do we know that because this isn't going to be in place until July 2012, at the earliest, will he guarantee that if they decide that prospecting is going to go ahead, that nothing will occur before the regulatory framework is in place? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Interim arrangements in place. Again, I say it would have been nice if the National Party had fronted up to the numerous meetings on this in the local community, to explain this, instead of sending poor officials from economic development who had to sit there and say, we don't know because it was a political decision. It was a political decision. So our community couldn't get the answers that they wanted because not a single national MP would front up. And I think that in itself is very, very telling, because the exploration that occurred in the Raukumara Basin, as the Minister well knows, has caused enormous distress in the East Coast communities. Iwi leaders who should have been part of the consultation heard about it on the news that it was happening, and then since then have not been able to get answers to some very simple questions that the community has had around that exploration in a very ecologically sensitive part of the marine environment. And what made it even worse was that for a number of years now, the move that people have been wanting to make is to actually put that area into a marine reserve. That was the kind of move from government that they were hoping the Raukumara Basin, because it's ecologically significant, because it's environmentally sensitive, because it's got breeding and feeding grounds, Minister, because it's got a number of endemic species. You're going to have to wait and hear our policy, Dr. Smith, with bated breath. But because none of the environmental protections were in place, and because it's an ecologically sensitive area, because it's incredibly seismically active, when you look at the number of shallow earthquakes over the last 10 years, with the exception of Canterbury, most of them have occurred in the very area where the exploration is taking place. And also it's interesting to note that the other part of the country where they're currently doing exploration is in Canterbury off the Canterbury coast. So the two most seismically active parts of the country are currently the areas where we're exploring. We know that these reserves are now harder and harder to get to because all the easy resources have already been exploited. And we have major concerns that it's the EPA that is going to be the body that is administering this particular piece of legislation, because the EPA is under-resourced, incredibly under-resourced for the amount of work and responsibility that the government is expecting it to carry out. It's not autonomous, so the Minister can direct it, and therefore it's not actually solely about protecting the environment. It's about carrying out the will of the government of the day, which is not what was promised. And most tellingly, the Environmental Protection Agency, in its purpose, doesn't actually have environmental protection as one of its purposes. An Environmental Protection Agency where the government refused to support an amendment that would have made environmental protection one of the purposes of the Environmental Protection Agency. And that tells you an awful lot about the particular agency that is going to be administering this legislation. And we don't have any detail on this. All the detail on this piece of legislation is going to be in regulation. And this is something that the government has been doing more and more of. So how anyone can have any confidence that this piece of legislation is going to protect it anyway, this is one of the reasons why Labor will not be supporting this piece of legislation. Because it comes from a minister who's weakened just about every single piece of environmental protection the previous government took in place, that has sat by while oil and gas exploration has been ramped up and then in the dying hours of this Parliament introduces a bill that would provide, he says, some form of protection, and we say we cannot see that in the legislation.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. Her time has expired. Members, the